Lizzie Darden, and I'm a photographer and visual artist. My work consists mostly of creative commercial photography, so partnering with a brand to showcase their product or whatever it is they're wanting to highlight, and incorporating that with my own personal style and my own personal brand, which is whimsy, a little bit of humor, and always super bright, colorful imagery. Whatever it is, it's going to involve some kind of pun or visual wordplay. As far as photography and editing goes, I am primarily self-taught, aside from one intro to photo class I took in college. So I'm a huge proponent of learning a lot of techniques on the internet, seeking out video tutorials on stuff you want to know, constantly wanting to learn and further the skills that you already have. So I'm really excited that you're here watching this tutorial today, and I really hope that you're able to take away some valuable tips and techniques, all while we play with some beautiful moodelier pieces. In this course, we're going to focus on textures, specifically the tricky ones that can be difficult to capture on camera and then retouch as well. Think metallics, glassware, feathers, fur. Whether you're shooting still lifes or product photography, adding in a variety of different textures is a really great way to add interest visually to your composition, but it's not always as easy as it looks. Getting the lighting right while you're shooting really is the key to nailing a lot of these. There's also a lot of little cheats that we can do after the fact to kind of finesse and perfect everything, so we'll be covering both of those areas. First off, I'll be using a fabric for my backdrop of this setup instead of a flat seamless paper roll. Using fabric is a really easy way to bring in a little subtle texture to your shot, but it definitely comes with its own challenges. I highly recommend investing in a small portable steamer. It's way easier than an iron, and you can really take care of creases and wrinkles while you're on set shooting instead of having to break down the set and iron everything out. Next up, let's cover reflective objects like glassware and metallics and chrome. For something that looks so pretty in real life, I personally am really drawn to shiny things. It really makes you work to capture it on camera. So for these types of shots, it's all about angles. We don't want to angle the camera directly at the reflective object, because then it's just going to act like a mirror and reflect back the camera and you and whatever else is facing it in the shot. So shoot your camera from above the scene a little bit, tilt it down on the tripod. Angling the lighting is super important for these as well. I like to shoot with a strobe light, which is essentially a really big external flash. When you position it at a high angle pointing down, it really mimics sunlight really well. But if you've ever been outside on a really sunny day and caught a glimpse of a car mirror, you know that can be blinding and everything just turns white. So for this scenario, we want to diffuse the strobe. I use a large fabric diffuser that's made specifically for this purpose. It's white and it's pretty thin, and it allows the light to pass through, but just spreads it out. You can also totally DIY this with parchment paper and wrap it around like a wooden frame or something. You absolutely want to make sure that if you're doing a DIY diffuser, that you don't use something flammable, because those strobe lights get crazy hot. So with your diffuser and strobe light setup and your camera, here's where you're gonna want either an extra set of hands or some C-stands, because we're gonna also add in a silver reflector. My reflector came in a set with my diffuser, and it's made of a foily silver type of fabric, but you can also use aluminum foil and wrap it around like a foam board, something sturdy. So if you can picture a semicircle kind of setup where the camera's in the center and the light source is on one side, we're gonna put that silver reflector on the opposite side. Just something to bounce that light back into the frame instead of a dark void, which just creates harsher shadows.
One final addition to this setup is a white foam board, which I'm using here to bounce light into the front of the scene. I'm doing this without the diffuser on and taking a few separate shots like this so that I can go into Photoshop and grab the highlights that I'm creating now to layer onto the image that I shot with the diffuser. Play around with the angle that you tilt the board and take a lot of shots so you have a lot of options when it's time to edit. Lastly, for tools, make sure you handle any reflective surface with gloves on, because you really don't want to be wasting time editing out fingerprints later. Also keep a microfiber cloth and a spray bottle of vinegar water mix on set to clean any glass that does become dirty. So before we get started retouching this shot, I want to quickly show you the difference the diffuser makes. This is a shot with no diffuser, just the direct strobe light and a reflector. And here is after the addition of the diffuser. So initially it might not seem like a hugely dramatic difference, but here you can see the highlights on this one are a little more scattered, whereas here with the diffuser you get a nice centralized highlight that's rounded and pretty. And on the gold metallic part here, you can also tell the diffuser gives you a full spectrum of shading, giving it more dimension, versus no diffuser, which flattens it out a bit. Overall, the diffuser makes the lighting of the scene much more even, and that directly affects any reflective object you're shooting. So you can see I've already started the editing process a little bit. I also did some basic edits in Camera Raw before getting to the Photoshop stage, where I brought up the highlights a little bit and also increased the contrast, which are two things that are gonna help define this glassware and reflective objects. One category of tools in Photoshop that I really like using for reflective objects are the dodge and burn tools. So this is my base layer here. I'm going to make a copy of it and name that dodge and burn, just so I'm not doing any destructive edits on my background layer, just in case I want to go back and recover it at any point. The dodge and burn tools are over here on the tool panel. The dodge is going to lighten parts of your image and the burn is going to darken it. And you have a lot of control over it because you apply it like a brush tool. Before you start in, make sure that your exposure is relatively low because we're gonna work slowly to build up the dodge and burn. So starting with dodging, I'm just going to pinpoint the areas that are already highlighted and use the dodge to push those highlights even more and make it pop. Just using really light, quick strokes. There are a couple other different ways that you can achieve this in Photoshop, but this is my preferred method because you really just have a lot of control. So we can quickly see the difference here by toggling this layer on and off. It definitely makes the highlights pop a little bit more and defines the edges. Now I'm going to go in with the burn tool and with the same principle, darken the parts that are already dark. And you can go back and forth with the dodge and burn tool, just kind of painting away until you get the results that you like. Let's take another before and after look here. The dodge and burn really emphasizes the edges of the glass, and depending how much you push it, you can really give a fun, hyper-realistic sort of vibe to your photo. No matter how much we try to avoid it through all the angling and the lighting, we're still going to have some reflection issues here, especially with a metal object that's so rounded like this one. You can see it's picking up a lot of the interior of my studio. It is natural and something that would occur in person as well, so I don't want to get rid of it completely and end up having it look computer generated. I just want to lessen the obviousness a bit so it's less of a distraction to the overall image. First, I'm going to blur by duplicating this layer here and applying a field blur to the new layer. This will give me a lot of control over the blur and also won't permanently affect the original image. So with its new layer selected, I'm going to go into Blur Gallery and Field Blur. And the default here is 15 pixels, which is kind of excessive here, so I'm going to drop that down to about 6 pixels. You can see it smoothed out that harshness a bit here. So now I'm going to apply a layer mask to this so that it only affects the chrome ball. And depending on how much of your surrounding your object actually picked up, you could possibly stop here at this point. For this one, I'm going to take it a step further by adding a brand new layer that I'll be painting on with my paintbrush at a very low opacity, about 8%, and nice and fluffy with 0% hardness. I'm going in and eyedropping the silver tones and lightly painting, following the natural curves and the shading of the ball. Use the eyedropper to pick up a new color pretty often so that everything is nicely blended. And if I do end up overdoing it, I can always decrease the opacity of this whole paint layer until I like how it looks. Finally, I'm going to add a layer mask to this layer as well to bring back in that bright highlight and clean up any stray edges. Toggling these two new layers on and off, you can really see the difference. Overall, it's a lot smoother, and while it still looks realistic, we're not getting a lot of those highly detailed distractions like in the original image. Now to wrap up reflections, let's tackle the disco balls. An object like this that has so many different facets can pick up unwanted surrounding scenery as well, as you can see with these red tones that don't exist in the actual setup. But since it's more abstracted, we can take care of it with just a simple hue saturation adjustment. I'm starting off by selecting the disco balls with the lasso tool and copying them onto a new layer. With this layer selected and going into Select, then Color Range, use the eyedropper tool to select all of the red shades here. You can see it's also selecting a lot of the rest of the image. The white is the part that's selected, but since we made the disco balls their own layer, it won't matter. Applying a hue saturation adjustment layer onto this, along with a clipping mask, will make sure only this disco ball layer is affected. From here, we'll bring down the saturation, maybe increase the lightness if your tones are too dark, and that's about it. It's a subtle difference, but it really polishes up the image.
Next up is liquid spills, intentional ones. If you're shooting food photography or recipes or anything like that, adding just the right amount of controlled chaos by food mess is a really great way to bring in some extra life to your photo and bring the quality of wanting to reach in and touch the food instead of everything being too perfectly polished. It can also help give a closer look at the texture of the food or drink or whatever it is that you're shooting, in case some of it is partially obscured by a bowl or a glass or whatnot. Since we don't want to ruin the fabric backdrop that we just so painstakingly steamed, or your wood or paper surface or whatever it is, clear projector sheets or acrylic sheets are a lifesaver here. You can buy projector sheets in packs online or at an office supply store, and unless you're really trying to, it's pretty impossible to stain them. They wipe right off and you can continue to use them and reuse them for different projects. I use these clear sheets all the time when I'm shooting messy foods, especially greasy things. You know, the kind that likes to leave a nice little ring of grease right on your expensive roll of paper. The sheets also come in handy if you're going to be shooting beauty products, you know, swatching colors of lipstick or foundation. The only issue with using these sheets is that they do have a little bit of reflective quality to them, so we really have to be mindful of that. And the workaround that we're going to use is we want to make sure that before we even set down the clear sheet or the liquid on top of it or anything, we want to make sure that we have a nice clear shot of everything else that's going to be in the image before adding the clear sheet in. Once we add in the clear sheet and the liquid on top of it, which in this case is going to be juice, we'll take another shot of that and then clip out the liquid from that shot and layer it onto the first clear shot. For working with liquids like this, I have a few other go-to tools that I have on hand: an eyedropper, a little tiny paintbrush, and of course a towel for when things get too messy and not planned messy. The eyedropper is really great because it's going to give you so much control over the liquid that you're actually putting onto your set, instead of just kind of pouring it and crossing your fingers that everything looks cute in the end. The eyedropper is also really handy if you're wanting just a few little droplets of oil or milk or whatever liquid you're using. Another tool that helps with the shaping of your liquid spill is going to be a tiny little paintbrush or a clean makeup brush in a pinch. You can use the brush to kind of gently push around the spill and shape it and kind of smooth out any jagged edges that happen. Next up, let's cover feathers. So anything with that wispy, thin kind of edge, like feathers, faux furs, fuzzy fabrics, hair, they all kind of fall under that same umbrella, and they can be super tricky to retouch, especially when it comes to clipping out these objects. For this example, I used a long peacock feather, a feather boa, and a fuzzy fabric to kind of encompass all of these at once. And the lighting is very similar to the previous example with the strobe light and the diffuser. So instead of focusing on the lighting setup for this, we're going to concentrate mostly on the editing techniques.
Let's start by clipping out this peacock feather here and replacing the orange background with a lilac. I'm going to select what's surrounding the feather instead of selecting the feather itself, because parts of it are so thin and narrow that it would be way too tedious. Your first instinct might be to use the magic wand tool here, but you can see with all of the pockets of spacing, that's going to take much longer. So instead, I'm going into select color range and selecting these shades of orange in the background with my eyedropper. It is including some other areas of the image, but for now, let's just focus on the feather and cross that bridge when we get there. When the selection is looking good, let's hit selected mask. As it stands now, the edges are a bit jagged and pixely, so let's check this smart radius box and pull the radius slider all the way up to around 70. And then a dash of smoothing. So that's looking pretty good already. The one issue now is that the orange background casts some orange onto the feather since it is a little shiny. So let's go into select color range again and grab those orange tints on the feather. And then on a new layer, paint in the new purple background color on top. We'll change this blending mode to color, and there we are. Now to bring back in the furry texture down here that got masked out, we're going to paint on the mask layer, adding with a white brush and erasing with a black brush. Leave the opacity of the brush at 100 and the hardness at 0, and then we'll slide the flow down to 10. That low flow rate is going to give a really natural, wispy quality when we're painting this back in. Take your time with this part and go back and forth between the black and the white brushes of the mask using short painterly strokes, and your edges will end up looking really nice.
Finally, in this shot, I threw in a hand because skin texture, especially hands with how much detail they have in them, can be super tough to edit. When you're retouching skin, it can be a slippery slope to overdoing it and can easily wind up with this plasticky effect, and then all of a sudden you're Sophia the robot. One note to keep in mind, it's super handy to have some kind of oil on hand, whether it's actual cuticle oil or actually olive oil works really well for this, to apply to the hands that you're shooting, especially around the nails and around the fingers, to help bring out the detail and give the light something to play with and bounce off, which brings more dimension.
Let's begin by duplicating this layer because I am going to be making some destructive edits here and I want to make sure I have a backup just in case. With hands, I always start off using the dodge tool at a low 5% exposure and just emphasizing the natural highlights around the fingers and the knuckles to add more dimension. I usually err on the side of too much highlight, especially when I'm editing an image for social media where it will be seen at a pretty small size because the high contrast will end up more impactful. Next, I'm going to clean up any scrapes or blemishes with the stamp tool at an opacity around 40% and using the tool sparingly. I'm paying the most attention to cleaning up the cuticle area here since the eye is naturally drawn to the fingertips first. Next, I'm going to make yet another duplicate layer so I can polish up the nails with the liquify tool. In the filter menu, select liquify and then using the forward warp tool, gently and slowly push the nails into the shape you want. With this method, you can shorten them, even them out, even make them extra long or squared off. For this example, I'll stick to rounding while also pushing the bottom of the polish back toward the cuticle, which is handy if you haven't been to the salon in a while. I use this technique the most when I'm working with a brand who prefers or requests a certain style of nail, but it's also helpful for when you break a nail right before a shoot or you just want to even things out. When you're done shaping, apply the liquify and add a mask to this layer to paint in just the nail areas that we just liquefied. This way you avoid accidentally warping any fingers. Finally, I'm adding a new layer above this that I can paint onto, and with a 0% hardness, 10% opacity brush, I'm going to lightly paint over the hand with the skin tones from eyedropping various sections of the hand. Be careful not to paint it on too thick. We're going for a very light smoothing finish without crossing into the too airbrush territory. If you do accidentally get a little heavy-handed with the paint, just lower the opacity of the layer so you can see the skin's natural texture show through a bit.
Thank you for following along with this course. I really hope that you found it helpful and hope that you can apply some of this to your own shoots. I know that you're going to love the rest of this course program because Moodelier has really partnered with some amazingly talented creatives.